The inside of the tavern is filled with people talking and laughing. As you enter in, the barkeep looks over at you and says, "Oi, can I get you lot a drink?" He is about to Actually, I'm your GM, and it's not a tavern. No. Taverns. Who uses taverns these days? As a matter of fact, the castle that you're in is on fire. There are great big warriors running everywhere, and there are just absolute chaos and pandemonium. Your characters are all on 1 hit point each because, well, you've been in battle for weeks and the game is just beginning. Hello and welcome to this episode of How to Be a Great GM. My name is Guy and today we're looking at the option of a guest GM or multiple GMs, as some questions have asked us on the various channels that we operate. That's Twitter, Discord, Facebook, all of those different spaces. People have been asking us questions, as well as down below in the video, links, comments and things. How can you run a game with multiple GMs? Should you run a game with multiple GMs? And what about just having a guest GM coming in from time to time? What does that do for your game? What does that do for your players? And what does it do for you as the game master? Well, that's what I'm going to try and answer in today's video. We're going to look at the various options and the benefits and the negatives, of course, that come along with having multiple GMs. And I'll give you some experience that I've had where I've actually run games with multiple GMs. So if that's something that you're interested in looking into, stay with us. Now, when we start looking at multiple GMs, we've got to ask ourselves some questions. Why would we want to have multiple GMs in the first place? What kind of disruption can we be expecting? What are the benefits that can be derived, I should say, from having multiple GMs? And then how do the mechanics work? How does it actually work of having multiple GMs? And how does that fit with your story narratively? So we're going to look at all of those different things. So if we then jump into it, hopefully, and we move on to why. Why would you want to have multiple GMs or a guest GM appearing in your show? Well, there are a couple things. Firstly, it gives you a very different perspective. Another GM coming in, even if you're playing in the same world, even if the GM is picking up, heaven forbid, in the middle of an adventure and they're running with it, there is going to be a different shift. We all look at Dungeons and Dragons and all the role-playing games for that matter from a different point of view. We run our games differently, and even though we might all be, for example, narrative GMs, or we might all be mechanics GM'd GMs, we all have a slightly different take on how things are going to work. So automatically, it's going to bring a different perspective to the game. It also means that the way that your players are going to interact with the GM is going to change. How you interact with one GM is going to be quite different from how you interact with another. Now, you might sit back and say, well, no, my players are always the same. They're always a bunch of hooligans. Yeah, but they're different types of hooligans for different types of GMs. With you, they've had experience, they know what they can push in terms of boundaries, they know where they can go in terms of taking the narrative or in terms of taking the mechanics. With a new GM or a different GM, those boundaries need to be set or discovered, I should say, and so that's going to influence your game. What it does for you as the GM, of course, is that it does give you a different perspective as well. This is what you had thought the campaign should be doing. You've now brought in a second GM or a third or whatever the case might be, and they're bringing a very different perspective to the whole thing. It can be great. It's also a tempo shift. It changes things up. If you are playing in a regular game and you say, all right, well, for the next month, we're going to have a guest GM, and that GM is going to take us through 4 sessions or so, and it's just a bit of a break for me as the GM. I want to experience some playing. I want to play with you guys, my favorite players. There are a whole bunch of things. It's definitely going to change the tempo. A long-term GM, you've got a long game plan. You've got a whole campaign plotted out. If you are on a temporary basis, if you're just a guest GM, well, you're going to be trying to pack in as much as you can, so you're going to generally have a faster-paced game. So that can also be quite fun to inject some life into things. GM guidance is another major benefit. If you are a novice GM and you have a guest GM coming in, you can talk to that guest GM. How did you plan your sessions? Once the session is over, you can then pick their brains and say, oh, well, when you did that, what was this for and what was that for? It's also useful if you're an experienced GM. You can see how other GMs go about their process, and you can either sharpen your own process, maybe cut some corners that you weren't necessarily cutting before, or find a more efficient way of doing something, or perhaps you might be able to help that GM by saying, I know what you tried to do there. I can't say that you succeeded. I would have done it differently. I would have done it this way or that way. You can compare notes. So basically, it allows you to get some insight into your own style, or to share your style with those who may not necessarily know it yet. So there's some benefits there. And of course it allows you as the game master to take a break. Sometimes that's all we need. We just need a little break from running the games, and it's refreshing to play. You can sometimes also forget what it's like to be a player. And so as a result, you kind of sometimes forget the little things. By being a player every now and again, it brings you right back to the coalface, as it were, where you can experience other GMs and get that perspective. So that's why you might want to bring in other GMs. That's why you might want to have a guest GM pop in every now and again, or to have a second GM who's part of the whole process from the very get-go, if you want a longer-term campaign, but the ability to switch in and switch out. What we then have to look at is the disruption, because ultimately this is going to bring about disruption. There is no ways that it can't do that. What kind of disruptions are we talking about? Well, the very first one is if the GM is one of the players and their character suddenly vanishes, where did the PC go? Did they get stuck on board the ship researching their uncle's diary? Did they wander off to start a tavern somewhere? If it's in mid-campaign and the party was lost in the middle of a field, did they get beamed up or consumed by the ground? What happened there, and how can you overcome that? So, well, that's something that you can look at, and we certainly do handle that in mechanics later on in the video, so stay with us for that. So, where did the PC go? How do we solve that question? It's an interesting one that you do need to solve. The other thing is if the GM continues to play that character as a GM PC, I've never particularly liked that term, but calling them an NPC just seems to debase them all the way down to cannon fodder. Nonetheless, if they are going to be played by the GM who's also GMing the game, there are all kinds of problems that come with that, and there will be a video coming out where we look at the GM PC and the problems that come with doing that. So that's a problem. What also happens to the main plot? If you have a guest GM who's just popping in, or it's a player who wants to try their hand, they want to stay in the same world, they want to stay in the same campaign, they might want to do a little side adventure or something along those lines. What then happens to the main plot? Does it basically go on pause? Is it like a break in the middle of a TV series? What is the story there? We need to find a solution for that, which I do handle in, as I said, later on in the video. And then what about attachments? What if we prefer the new GM to the old GM? How is that going to work? What happens if our PCs are attached to something, the new GM comes in and they wash it away because, well, they didn't see it having any kind of value? That also is incredibly disruptive. So you've got to look at those kind of components and think, well, can we survive without them? Is there a way of retconning it? Is there a way of working around it? I hate the idea of undoing the work the guest GM has done. Kind of defeats the point of having a guest GM in the first place. So, I beg your pardon, the flu has still not left me in case you can't hear that. The idea of what are the disruptive factors, they lead us to start to look for mechanical solutions that will continue to keep our game fun and entertaining, whilst at the same time capitalizing on some of the benefits that we would get from having a guest GM. And what are those benefits? Well, the benefits is that suddenly, you, as the GM, you can show and guide your fellow players. So you are the GM of the campaign. Your players have been struggling with certain key points, and you don't want to bring in an NPC who's going to help them, but you decide that you're going to have a guest GM come in, and whilst that guest GM is there, you're going to play a character who may be able to give them some advice or some pointers in the right direction. It might be very metagaming to do this, so I would advise that you do it with caution. But if you find that your party is perhaps very murder hobo-esque, and you haven't tried any of the solutions in the video on Are You a Murder Hobo, or how to deal with murder hobos, which are also on this channel, if you find that they are perhaps a little bit too gung-ho, maybe they're a little bit too reluctant, maybe they need a bit of direction in their lives, you can create a character who steps in and shows them the right way to do it. It does give it a little bit more of a hands-on feel and less like an NPC telling them what to do if you are actually playing it and then are showing them how to do it yourself. Be warned, this is not a platform for you to show your players how to be a good player. In terms of, look, I'm such a marvelous player. Do not brag, do not boast, do not say, look at what I'm doing and do it like me. That does not come across well. Rather, play the game as you would. Lead by demonstration rather than by explanation, I always say. It does also give you tremendous insight as the GM into the players and into the player characters. There's nothing quite like having your own character interact with PCs or having your own discussions post-game with the players to really get an insight into how they think and what they think. So after that GM session has happened, the guest GM has left, you all gather around with cups of coffee, and hopefully they're saying, oh, well, we really do like the way that you run games. This new bloke or this new lass is not bad, but we prefer your... Hopefully that's what you're getting, at least certainly it's always nice for the ego, isn't it? But the main value of it is to be able to see how your players think and to position yourself going, well, this is what I would do with this new GM. What are my players going to be thinking about? Gives you some insight there. It is, of course, a new GM you might be introducing to the world of role-playing. If you are introducing a player into the elevated ranks of being a GM, that is fantastic, and there is always benefit to having more GMs. More GMs mean more games, more players mean more GMs that learn and have good games mean better games for all of us, and it is a wonderful, wonderful cycle of good and better role-playing games. So whenever you can encourage a player to become a GM, it's a safe space, they know the environment, they know the world that you're playing in because they themselves have been playing in it for quite some time. It's a wonderful, wonderful incubation space where new players can become GMs. It also allows you to get feedback, so you can see your own world through the eyes of your own character rather than as the GM. You might have created this empire which is absolutely wonderful and amazing and a total authoritarian regime of terror and horror, but once you are actually in it, you yourself might get some interesting ideas in terms of, well, maybe I should add in a rebellion group. You get a fresh perspective on your own world. There's nothing better than visiting your own city and seeing it through the eyes of your own character rather than as a GM. So there are many, many benefits to having somebody else come in and run a game in your space, in your environment. It really can give you some insights if you are open to it. Now that's the important thing. When you are having a guest GM, you as the GM in residence, you as the master of this world, you need to step back and not stand on that poor GM's coattails and prevent them from moving forward. If they are running the game, it is their game. They can do with it as they will. And if that means changing your setting, if that means changing some of your fundamental plans, you invited them into that space. You must now accommodate and move forward with it. So how do we do that? How do we mechanically make sure that when we have this guest GM who's bringing in all of these benefits, who's giving us all sorts of wonderful insights and making us better game masters as we happen to be, how do we make sure that that happens? Well, we look at it from a mechanical perspective. When we invite the guest GM into our group, into our game, we need to set some boundaries, and these boundaries are certainly going to help. Now, there are many, many, many options here. The boundaries could be that it's a pocket dimension that the characters have found themselves in. So you set it up at the end of the last adventure that you're going to be running until the new GM has taken over, that the players characters anyway, enter into a pocket dimension, and everything and anything is up for grabs. That means your new guest GM has a whole canvas to work in that's still all the familiar, but it's now their familiar and they can do with it as they will. That takes your main plot and puts it on pause, basically, whilst the PCs are wandering around in this pocket dimension. So you can certainly do something like that. You can, of course, make the whole thing feel as if it was a dream. The PCs are not actually on this journey. They're not actually going through this process. They are dreaming it. Mechanically, if you have a system that requires leveling or advancement of some kind, you will need to accommodate for that, because basically the player character goes to sleep and wakes up the next morning 5 levels stronger and with more gold and trinkets than they had before. Or do you just wash it all away? The risk with wash it all away in terms of making it a dream is that your players, your other players, your regular players, might get frustrated by that fact. They need some kind of reward, so bear that in mind. It could be a vision of the future. This is the characters in 3 months' time, 3 years' time. That way you can use all of the secrets of using the future dreams and those kinds of things. Also, I think I've done a video on that. You can have a look at that. You can use all of that information that the new GM seeded and then repurpose it as your own. It is a vision of a potential future, after all, not the actual future. You can use elements of it in your game moving forward, and it seems as if everything has still remained part of the same narrative, even though it's been a different GM. Alternatively, you could split the party. One party gets on board a ship, the ship sinks, the party is split into different ways as the ocean currents pull them off in different directions, and so that's why the one PC is missing, whilst the rest of the party, I should say, continue on this tropical island adventure or land adventure or wherever they happen to end up. Splitting the party in a dungeon is a similar kind of effect. Where was McNab during this last 4-week session? McNab was down the other alleyway, and when McNab returns, i.e. the GM now resumes back as the player character, if that's the case, well, he was simply wandering around. As a wonderful example of that, if you ever watch a film called Shaun of the Dead, a very early British film by Simon Pegg and Nick Frost, lovely film as a matter of fact, about zombies, there's on the DVD anyway, there's a special section where they talk about, remember when we ran around the corridor or the alleyway and so-and-so ran off to the left, and then the next scene so-and-so ran in from the other door? Well, here's what happened in between, and they literally take you through what happened whilst the party was split in the film. Now, of course, in the film, you don't pay any attention to it most of the time, and so it's a wonderful little insight. So you can do that. Reasons to go would be another one. I had an instance where a player couldn't make the game, and we wanted to carry on. It was only one of 5 players who couldn't make it, so we carried on. That player just happened to be visiting a friend or an aunt or recuperating or whatever the situation appropriate state was. The challenge that I ran with that, however, was that the party themselves moved significant distance over a significant time shift as well. They were 5 days ahead of the character and several hundred miles away from the character when that player returned. I somehow had to then reconcile getting that character to the other characters on the other side of the planet. As a game master, that required some rather creative and inventive ways of doing it. I think I managed to pull it off without the players noticing too much, but that is something that you're going to have to come up with if the party has been split, if they have a reason to go in the opposite direction. Unlike dreams, visions, and pocket dimensions, where it's just this weird little twist of time, so time itself hasn't actually changed, location hasn't actually changed. Then an old trick which I know used to work for, especially for older groups in the past, is a ring of forgetfulness. I had a game master who used to run a game where it was every second Sunday in the afternoon, and it was a lot of people who were busy and they had children and the like, and so the group probably comprised of about 8 people in total, 7 players, but never 7 players could attend the same session. Usually it was about 4 of the 7. So all that the GM did was that there was a ring that every character had. It wasn't voluntary, it was a cursed item, and when a player couldn't make it, the rest of the group, as far as they were concerned, they completely forgot about the player's character, and as if they had never existed before. Any equipment, any memories, any thoughts that that player character had were simply erased from history. It did require the players to have a certain amount of mental alacrity in order to be able to remember, oh no wait, that was so-and-so, and so-and-so never existed, so that means that that didn't happen, or it means that that happened but it was somebody else who did it. There was a definite metagame requirement to do that. You can do the same thing when one of the players becomes the GM, or when a new GM comes in and some weird stuff happens. If you can manage it, the Ring of Forgetfulness is possibly the easiest way out, but at the same time it's the least narrative way out of the situation, and some people don't like breaking the narrative with a meta magic item, so to speak. So those are the ways and means that we look at having multiple GMs in our games, and why we would want to have multiple GMs or guest GMs. Now, I have had an instance where I had two GMs. It was myself and a friend of mine, and I think I've spoken about this before. His responsibility was the rules, my responsibility was the story. So whenever I would ask the characters, all right, you're moving through quicksand, he would page through the books quickly to find out the rules for moving through quicksand. He would find the rule and he would ask the players for the appropriate roles and such like. I would be responsible for describing what happened if they failed or if they succeeded, and then he would be responsible for combat. He would organize the maps beforehand, he would organize the minis. We used to use minis on grid in those days. I think we were playing 4th edition Dungeons and Dragons, and he would preempt all of that whilst I was doing the shopping montage or the inn montage or whatever the situation was. It worked really well, and the players seemed to respond to the quickness with which it allowed for rules decisions to be made, as well as for the game to kind of flow and move forward. For him, he enjoyed listening to the story and prepping the rules, the mechanics and the like. And we ran that game for about 3 months, I think, before eventually he decided that he'd like to run his own game. And I then switched roles to being the rules support, which everyone decided was generally a bad idea. Anyway, it was a different approach to running a game. It was very interesting. We would discuss plot points, we would discuss major plot direction and the like, but it was reliant primarily on myself in terms of the narrative side of things. Having guest GMs, I love having guest GMs when I can find them, provided that they are up to the same sort of caliber that my players expect and are not too different in style from myself. And that's something important. If you haven't looked at the video on GM styles, I suggest you do. Trying to find a GM who fits with your style is probably the better way of replacing or having a guest GM than bringing in a guest GM who's very different. If you bring in a simulationist guest GM and you are a narrative guest GM, you are a narrative GM, I should say, your players are going to have a strong disconnect. Their characters that have been built around a narrative focus are going to struggle in a simulationist's game where they are looking at reality and making sure that everything is absolutely perfect. So try and align those beforehand by just chatting to the guest GM and saying, well, this is how I run my games, this is how I would like you to run the game as well. Now, if you happen to be a guest GM, I think the important thing to bear in mind is that you are here to breathe life into a campaign, perhaps. You are here to shed some insight for the GM who will hopefully be participating as a character in that world. And it's your opportunity, I think, to take an existing space, to take an existing environment, and to create a self-contained short adventure that you can run with a bunch of experienced characters who have worked together before, and just have a bit of fun playing in somebody else's world. Try and learn as much from that GM as possible in terms of how they go about planning things, how they go about setting up things, and it's always fun to play with new characters and new players. Well, new players, I should say, not new characters, new players, and yeah, to just have fun. If you have any other ways of how you like to incorporate guest GMs, or if you yourself are a frequent guest GM and you have some insight, please let us know down below. We would love to hear it. If you haven't yet heard the news, I am running a live game on Twitch. That's twitch.tv/GreatGM. I run a live game every Monday at 6 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, where it's called The Broken World Chronicles. And there is all about fractured universes, multiple dimensions and the like, where the possibility for guest GMs would be quite good, as a matter of fact, because as the characters step out of one world, they step into another, and it's a very different environment, and so a different GM could take over without too much of a problem. Anyway, if you haven't joined me for that, have a look out for it. It's a lot of fun. It's only just kicked off, so you haven't missed too much if you haven't seen it already. But if you want to join in some shenanigans and see how I plan the shows and how I review the show thereafter, I do that as well. Half an hour before the show and half an hour after the show, I break down what my plan is for that particular adventure, and then after the show I break down how I tried to bring it back to what my original plan was after it has gone through the washing machine of interacting with my characters and with my players. So there's lots of insight there as well. That show is also then released onto my other YouTube channel. That's Great GM Sessions. You can find the link down below, where you can then watch it at your leisure in 2 1-hour blocks. There's also a Patreon for that if you want to support that show and the cast thereof and get access to podcasts and other bits and pieces. You can go and have a look at that at patreon.com/brokenworlds. And I look forward to seeing you, whether it's here, whether it's there, whether it's on the battlefield itself. Who knows? Hopefully we will get to play together at some point, or at least you and your players get to have a good game either this weekend or next weekend or whenever it is that you happen to play. What I'm trying to say in general is until next time, the very happiest of gaming.